Hello and welcome to Fast Talk, your trusted source for the science of endurance performance. I'm Dr. Griffin McMath. Today's episode marks an exciting new chapter for our show. We've got a hot topic to explore, and you'll also hear from a very familiar voice returning to Fast Talk in a new role. Nutrition apps are everywhere these days, from in-platform features to standalone AI-driven tools that promise to optimize fueling. But how helpful are they really? What do they get right? Where can they lead athletes astray? To help us tackle these questions, we'll be hearing from Fast Talk Labs Director of Exercise Physiology and Sports Nutrition Services, Jared Berg, Olympian and veteran World Tour rider Brent Bookwalter, endurance sports scientist Dr. Paul Larson, and our own CEO, Trevor Connor. And with that, let's jump into today's conversation, which begins with a warm welcome back to my new co-host here on Fast Talk, Julie Young. So tune your instincts before you tune your app, and let's make you fast.
So we all know that the fastest way to stop progressing is to get injured. And that's why managing load matters. Athletiqs keeps an eye on your training stress, helping you adapt before it's too much. It's the same principle we talk about at Fast Talk Labs. Train smarter, not harder. Learn more at athletiqs.ai and use code FASTTALK to save 15% off a 6-month plan. We'll see you there.
I have something very exciting to share today. Today, we are welcoming back a very familiar voice at Fast Talk Podcast, the former co-host of Fast Talk Femme. But today is her inaugural episode now as the new co-host of Fast Talk Podcast. Welcome back, Julie Young.
Thanks, Griffin. I appreciate that. And I'm super excited to be back. I love the opportunity to do these episodes. It's so stimulating and get to talk about fun topics and meet neat people. So I'm super excited.
Can you help us understand what are we talking about today? Why is this so important, especially to you? And who did you bring along for the ride?
So I thought today, no one better to talk about this subject than Jared Berg. And I know Jared's been on the Fast Talk podcast in previous episodes, but Jared, welcome to Fast Talk.
Thank you, Julie. I look forward to going over this with you guys. I'm definitely really excited to be here. Very interesting topic. And it's going to be fun to start thinking critically about these and sort of offer what insight I can give as a registered dietitian and exercise physiologist.
Jared, would you mind? I think your background is so pertinent to this episode. And I think, you provide so much legitimacy in terms of what you have to offer. Could you provide the listeners with a little bit of information on what you've been doing in the past and what you're doing now?
Sure can. Yeah. So for years, I've been working as an exercise physiologist. I've done that with CU Sports Performance Center on campus here in Boulder, Colorado. And then most recently, I've started on with Fast Talk Labs as their service director for their exercise physiology and sports nutrition services. And then, I have a master's in nutrition and I've been practicing RD for a few years now. And it's just exciting world. I've been working with lots of different athletes for almost 3 decades. I work with a lot of elite level professional triathletes and cyclists and amateurs and individuals, looking to climb Mount Everest and those kind of adventures. I have an athlete coming in about 2 hours who is looking to climb all 7 of the highest peaks on the 7 continents. So all kinds of exciting adventures I get to sort of be a part of, which is really pretty cool. Love my job.
That is so cool, Jared. That's
Isn't
awesome.
That fun?
What a feat. Wow.
Yeah. She's super cool. I'm excited to work with her this afternoon. And I've worked with her before in the past. And it's fun to dive in.
And Jared, you've done quite a bit of work with Dr. Sanmilan as well, correct?
Yeah, he was a mentor of mine at CU Sports Performance. Super fun guy, brilliant, and also humble. And it's been fun working with him for years and look forward to actually reconnecting with him sometime in the future here.
Well, I really appreciate just your depth of obviously scientific experience and knowledge, but also your application and practice. So I thought we would start by just talking about a few of these apps and features that are on the market, because again, there's a gazillion out there. I thought for today, we would talk about the nutrition feature that's built into TrainingPeaks. I'm sure people that are users of TrainingPeaks have probably noticed there's now included a feature for carb and fat use during a ride. And then also the Fuelin app, which I've started to see. So I'm really curious about this one because I've definitely started to see it populate TrainingPeaks with athletes that I work with. And then Athlete's Food Coach. But those were the few that I thought we would focus on today because I think it essentially helps us understand probably that whole environment.
Is there a reason you chose these three specifically?
I mean, I think selfishly, it's just what I've had experience with. And so, I think in my world where I'm working primarily with endurance athletes and the majority of those being cyclists, these are the apps that I'm seeing mostly. So, of course, TrainingPeaks, so many coaches are working on TrainingPeaks now. Like I said, Fuelin, I've started to see a couple of my athletes use it and it's populating into TrainingPeaks. So I've been curious about the principles behind that app. And then Athlete's Food Coach was developed by Dr. Jukendroop, Asker Jukendroop, who's worked quite significantly with the Jumbo team, Jumbo Visma. And from what I gather, this is probably based on the work he's done with that team, which kind of puts into question maybe, I don't know, Jared, what you think about this, not to get too far ahead of the game. But, if you're working with that kind of a population, with a bunch of outliers that are these elite athletes, like how translatable is that to all of us mere mortals? So I think, really credible sources and obviously some interesting data kind of in terms of how they built these apps. So Jared, those were the top of my list, apps and features that I wanted to talk about. Were there any others that you had in mind?
Well, I would say that there's basically two other apps I have in mind. Only one I feel like we really need to cover, but the two apps I'm thinking of is MyFitnessPal and Cronometer, right? Cronometer is an app that is just, has a really good database of accurate nutrition logging features to help you figure out how many calories you're taking in and where your macros lie and such. And that's kind of a neat app just because it has, from a dietitian perspective, they have a sort of dietitian or provider dashboard. I don't want to cover Cronometer too much just because it doesn't really integrate with TrainingPeaks from my understanding. However, I do have quite a bit of athletes that I work with using MyFitnessPal as a nutrition logging app. And that can sync up with TrainingPeaks so we can understand energy balance, right? And then at least get a feel for whether the athlete's expenditure is matching up with their intake. And MyFitnessPal has a pretty good database of foods and such and allows the athlete to fairly easily track their nutrition throughout the day and week.
I think what Jared just said is really important. He just pointed out who is using these apps. So for the second one that he mentioned, a lot of clinicians or healthcare practitioners of a variety of types will use that with their patients, not necessarily coaches with their athletes. So for those who are listening, I think we need to really frame the apps that we're going to talk about today from the perspective of the athlete with their nutrition in their sport, not necessarily for their nutrition and their healthcare. So I think as long as we keep that in mind, then this selection of apps will really make sense and we're going to understand why we're diving into these in particular.
Good point. Context, always important. Context and relevancy.
I think we have to look at this as what tool and what we're hoping to get out of it and the purpose of it. So could we just, again, for context, understand what the purpose of these apps should be for the athlete, Julie, or what you're hoping to imply?
The main theme may be like, hey, we're not looking for perfection here. I think maybe it's an eye-opener. Maybe it's a little bit of a reality check. And I think per what Jared said, there's no intention to be perfect with these things. And I think, it's keeping perspective, which is so important in terms of using these in a healthy way.
Exercise physiologist Dr. Paul Larson is experienced with nutrition apps and is seeing firsthand what AI can do for our training software. Here are his thoughts on the potential for these apps.
I'm pretty familiar with the nutrition apps, and I think they're doing a great job to get insight into some of the various different aspects around nutrition, the calories, macronutrients, micronutrients, phytochemicals, minerals, vitamins, all these different things that are important. Like anything, we have to take it with a grain of salt. There is going to be certainly variation between what the user is providing in terms of their dietary recall with those. That being said, the world of AI is definitely exploding, and pictures of the food that are being consumed is now possible with some of these dietary apps. And that's going to only enhance the accuracy of some of the food and nutrient data and insight from it. So it's an exciting space, and I'm sure we continue to evolve. We're going to see that more and more in the very near future.
So I thought before we dive into like our specific experience with using these different apps and features, that perhaps, Jared, you could provide us with kind of the principles that are in most cases probably guiding these recommendations from these apps and features in terms of metabolism, bioenergetics. Can you kind of give us an overview of those concepts?
Sure, I can try to do that. So ideally what the apps are looking to do is to, number one, be able to help an athlete achieve the energy balance they're looking for. Okay. And then you'll see in these apps, they'll be like, hey, what are your goals? Right? Are your goals to maintain weight, to gain weight, to lose? And ideally, the app is hoping to adjust its recommendations based off of what your goals are, right? And then what it's going to do from there is go from energy balance, then break it down into the specific macronutrients. How many carbs, how much protein, how much fat do you need to consume on the daily or at each meal or in your snacks in order to sort of optimize your nutrition intake to sort of meet your needs and also help you towards your goals. So I'm not speaking for every app, I'm talking about more as a whole. Maybe that app is looking to try to understand, hey, you did this type of workout, right? If you did this type of workout at this intensity for this length, how much should you be trying to consume of carbohydrates versus fat or protein in order to optimize your performance, your recovery, and achieve that energy balance you're looking for, right? And that's sort of what it's going for.
So would you say like the overriding, probably the main priority of these apps is first and foremost that energy balance, and then secondarily the macronutrients?
Yes, it should be. I mean, I think it would be too deep in the woods if we're trying to, hey, let's try to match out the right micronutrients and see if we're getting the bioactive compounds, that's necessary to, increase health span and longevity and support, mitochondrial health and that kind of thing. That's a little too deep for, I think, an app to go through. And that's where you might work with a, registered dietitian or an MD to figure out those specifics. But those apps in general, yeah, if we talk about energy balance, that's going to be I would say the utmost importance. That's number one priority. And then the macronutrients.
Can you explain to our listeners how the resting metabolic rate plays into these numbers?
So we're trying to, like you and I, we're trying to figure out what are the sort of the experts in design of these apps. What are they thinking about? What are they doing? And how are they coming about these recommendations? And so we were looking at TrainingPeaks files, right? And those files would give a specific calorie amount that it's estimating that you burnt in that specific workout, right? And then we're wondering, well, are those calories accounting for the resting metabolic rate that is happening in the background? Everybody needs to exist as a body in space, right? How many calories does it take to exist? And so is that, existing calorie expenditure accounted in the total calories in TrainingPeaks? And we worked out some numbers and sort of kind of crunched some stuff. And we felt like it really wasn't, right? That in the background that, 80, 90 or so calories per hour that somebody is sort of burning at rest. And that's going to vary from 80 to 90 based on the individual, right? Wasn't being accounted for the total calories. However, when we did the math on kilojoules for cycling, we found out the kilojoules actually match up with what was expended during the ride, right? And it actually counted more for like what we needed to replace. And we could find a little more accurate recommendation for what needed to be replaced during a bike specifically.
So the kilojoules are accounting more directly for the actual work being done.
Yes.
As opposed to kind of bringing in what the body's doing behind the scenes.
Exactly. Yeah. We have this really cool mechanism in our bodies, actually two mechanisms. One is hunger and the other is satiety.
Yeah, I don't know if you've heard of these two things. They're pretty cool.
You've heard of it?
Yeah.
They're going to catch on. I know it.
Yeah.
So you have to think about it like that perspective. It's like our bodies should ideally know that we've just worked out, we've done a lot, and we need to fill those needs. And then we're going to sort of eat and take in our nutrition and hydrate until we have satisfied those needs. So it's as simple as that. And are the apps going to be able to tell us? Maybe they can give us some good insight and some reminders and some cues and some targets. And they can certainly help. I do have athletes I work with who we're pretty convinced do not have those healthy hunger and satiety cues, but that's not the norm. Most of us do pretty well. We have a great hormone regulatory system and biofeedback between our gut-brain axis. And so there's just lots of positives. Our bodies are amazing and they help us stay in check.
Yeah. If I could snap my fingers and ask all the apps to do a prerequisite before they focused on all of the data they are focusing on right now, it would be after a workout gets logged or after you input what you've eaten and the gels that you've used, that it actually pops up questions to help increase the self-awareness of that particular user. How did you feel? Did you notice XYZ symptoms during this period? So that instead of this kind of learned helplessness, so that I've put the data in and this AI model is going to tell me something back about myself. So I'm going to increasingly rely on this because it has this information that you're actually teaching the user just as much as the model is learning at the same time about themselves. So if we were able to have the app say, this is the composition of what you just ate, this is the impact of the workout that you just had, did you notice XYZ? That would be amazing to me as far as data that the athlete can actually use without having to rely on this AI model down the line.
I mean, it's like helping athletes connect the dots, right? It's basically what you're saying. And I think no matter like personalities, whether we're talking food or we're talking technology, we all come from different places. So I know some people, like athletes that I work with, want nothing to do with data. They're just like all perceived exertion. And some are just so like just obsessed and enamored. And I think we just need to be careful. Like we don't want to turn the decision-making over. We want to use it to better inform. And I think trying to bring people to that middle point, because I do think this can be valuable. And I do feel like it can help athletes become more intuitive. Because like Jared, as you said, most people probably have that ability, but I know some athletes that I work with that are such hard chargers and they're so in control and they can really deprive themselves. And so I think it is a good little eye opener. And it's at the end of the day, you just want the athlete to become intuitive. You don't want them to become ever reliant on these things, ever reliant on logging, but it's just an eye opener.
I think that's why so many coaches or practitioners will have some type of, they might even formalize it like a usage contract with their athlete or their patient about how they will use this particular tech tool. And that's not only, this is the expectation for how we're going to use this, how you're going to input data and your relationship with this and how I'm going to read the data, but also how you might offboard from a particular tool during off season or something so that there isn't this lifestyle obsession with this data, right? And not only, okay, this is the contract, the expectation of how we're going to onboard with this tool, how we're going to relate to it during this time period, how you're going to wean off of it at a certain point, and then also how often you're going to check this data. And I think maybe at the end, we should circle back on each of our experiences with best practices of these. But I know that some people will also say you're only allowed to look at nutritional data as the user once a week so that you're not obsessing over numbers or going down a rabbit hole. But I really liked the idea of usage contracts with an athlete and their coach or an athlete and their RD.
But I also do think it is the personality too, because I know just having kind of done these kind of things with certain athletes, those that are very type A, very perfectionist, it's tough. You got to just set the stage, create that perspective. We're not trying to be perfect with this. You just don't want to get too far down in the weeds. You want to stay up high.
Let's pause for a moment and hear from Brent Bookwalter, who emphasizes the point that an athlete's experience with nutrition apps is very individual.
What can really help and support someone enhance and optimize a strength or improve a deficit or a weakness for one person can be totally different for the next person. So I do think that there is no one size fits all approach of you cannot universally say, if you're going to run a team or if I'm going to coach and guide a team of riders, there's no way that I would require every athlete on that team to use and comply with a nutrition app. It means something different to everyone, and it's a loaded area of body image and self-identity. The relationship we have with food as endurance athletes is a very complicated one that I think we need to be sensitive to on an individual basis.
I think it is really important for people to understand that there is this tool, and anytime that you're experiencing certain symptoms or if you have really lofty goals, these are circumstances where you should be seeking out a professional rather than using an AI tool to give you guidance. And that could be from a RD, there's MD. I obviously am an ND, and nutrition was a massive component of my naturopathic medical education. You also have a variety of other healthcare practitioners who have training and background in providing this expertise.
Listeners, Fast Talk needs your help. We want to know what you think of our episodes, our guests, our hosts, and more. Please take a brief survey at fasttalklabs.com/survey to let us know what you think. Your opinion matters, and your responses will help shape the future of Fast Talk. Get started today at fasttalklabs.com/survey.
So I thought now we would just kind of dive a little deeper into these particular features and apps that we've mentioned, and just dive a little deeper into how they've been formulated, the models. So I thought we'd start with TrainingPeaks. And I've actually been chatting with the folks that are helping to develop that feature. And so they've shared with me the ways that they're developing these models, which I think is interesting. I would assume, this isn't something that I verified with them, but I'm assuming they're predicting a ride's caloric requirement prior to that ride, because I'll see that populated in TrainingPeaks prior to the athlete actually completing the ride based on intensity factor and TSS, because they don't have any heart rates to go off of.
That seems like a pretty fair assumption, Julie. Yeah, I mean, they know how long the prescribed ride is supposed to be. There's the recommendations for intensity, so they're going to have a pretty good feel for the intensity that the ride is supposed to be at, and then be able to make an assumption of how much carbohydrate versus fat is going to be expended during that ride.
So that's the first step. And then for folks that have used this feature, basically you go into TrainingPeaks and you set your profile. So they have these different metabolic profiles or categories. So you're a recreational athlete, you're amateur, you're competitive, you're elite, that sort of thing. And so what the folks at TrainingPeaks have shared with me is they're essentially developing their models mainly on these 3 studies done primarily by Dr. Sanmalan, one in conjunction with George Brooks. The first one is a 2018 study by Sanmalan and Brooks assessing metabolic flexibility using blood lactate levels alongside fat and carbohydrate oxidation rates. The next study was done by Dr. Sanmalan in 2009, and it was metabolic profiling across cycling categories, helping to establish normative patterns of substrate utilization based on fitness level. And then the last one is one that's actually under review. It was completed by Dr. Sanmalan in 2024, but it was 200 male and female cyclists from pro to recreationalists to understand gender-specific substrate utilization curves at a range of intensities. So that's the basis for their models. Jared, do you have any thoughts on that?
So those studies are all trying to look at what specific intensity is an athlete using what type of substrate. Substrate basically means fat or carbohydrate in this sense. We're not looking at protein utilization. So I would imagine in these studies, they're controlling for diet. I would think that would be one of the variables, but I do not know. I've worked a lot with Dr. Sanmalan, and I feel like my practice, and just like yourself, Julie, is a constant study. And so, you and I are going through hundreds of metabolic tests each year, and we're getting a chance to see what's happening from a substrate utilization, total calorie expenditure at various intensities. But the big thing I want to sort of mention is how easily manipulated these substrate utilizations are based off of dietary habits, right? When someone comes into our lab with low carbohydrate availability, we often see a really different amount of fat versus carbohydrate utilization that's not irrelevant of their specific performance level, how strong of an endurance athlete they are. And so that's one thing I want to think about. Yeah, it's like these studies may give some good answers and some ideas, but somebody could have very different characteristics in their energy and substrate utilization based off of just their diet.
That's a really good point. And something that I initially thought about when I saw these features is it's not necessarily the intensity that you're doing that determines what you're burning. It's, obviously what you ate right before. So it's hard to look at that in just a silo and just determine, oh, this ride is a long endurance ride. So you're going to be doing this much fat and this much carb. So it's taking into consideration that bigger picture. And then the other thing that is a little concerning for me, I guess, is, being in the lab and doing these tests, and even within these metabolic profiles or categories, I still see a huge range of variability with athletes in terms of their efficiency. Some people are like burning carbs like almost right away, and others are way out there within the same category of profiled rider.
The last study that you mentioned that talked about sex differences that they're trying to apply, that's one of the critiques that I've seen in a lot of these apps in their learning models and in what they're recommending to users is basically what information is being utilized to make those recommendations. When you create an account and you say male, female, prefer not to answer, what are each of these apps actually deciding based on that first click? And being able to be shown the exact data that they're using to completely make a left or a grand swing on any of these is really important. And so I'm curious, Jared, I was so excited when you talked about the athlete that's coming in a couple hours and then you said she. I was like, hell yeah, love to hear it. If you've noticed any discrepancy there on the recommendations, because ultimately these apps that are also using user information to further guide it, I do wonder if there's additional error there, because how are we getting real-time data that's actually accurate for some of these apps rather than some, self-reported metrics? Can you speak to any discrepancy there that you've seen?
I would say there's going to have to be discrepancy. Really, there's going to have to be like an error when you're looking at you're just inputting a few different things about yourself, like I'm an elite athlete or I'm an amateur or I'm in the middle, right? Then it's not going to account for your specific muscle composition. I will see a pretty good variability among athletes, and I'll get somebody into the lab and I'll do a metabolic test with them, and I'll be like, I know you're really shooting for half Ironman and Ironman competition, but have you ever thought about doing sprint nationals? Because you do have a metabolic profile that shows a affinity towards sort of faster, more higher intensity type proficiency. And so, I'll definitely see that quite often. And I don't feel like just by categorizing somebody that specific way, you're going to get exactly what you need. And you're finding energy balance a little bit harder, and actually more specifically, the substrate, the carbs versus fat is going to be a little bit off.
Julie, you just got really excited about what he just said there. For people listening, Julie was nodding her head a lot about the sprint comment. Can you explain why you're clearly concurring with him?
I think it's just, working with athletes, and I feel like sometimes they're just bound and determined to do a certain event. Because I feel like we're in this world right now where more is better, and always doing the longer, unbound, you got to do 350 or, it's like always getting more and more. And I just think athletes do themselves a disservice when they're not honoring what's their natural propensity, what's their natural strength, and really leveraging that and setting themselves up for success. So I feel like a lot of times it's trying to jam that square peg into that round hole, and they're failing, and it's like, consider some other options. You don't always have to do a 12,000 kilometer race, like Jared said, consider what are your strengths as an athlete and maybe pursue that.
So then, Jared, have these types of apps and this type of data been a mirror for you back to athletes to say, hey, the apps that data is showing, you might be better suited for something? Is that a hidden benefit of these apps?
I would say not yet. No. It would be amazing if it was, but I still need my metabolic card for that. I still need to be doing a lactate in combination with, respiratory data and to really see how much fat, how much carbohydrates somebody's using, how much oxygen uptake, and then where does that lactate fall along with those sort of physiological inflection points.
Great.
I don't know if Jared and Griffin, you've had experience working with those features in TrainingPeaks.
I've just started. I was just able to get hooked up on having the TrainingPeaks beta version where I can get my athletes going on sort of how much carb versus fat and total energy expenditure is, getting those sort of dialed. And I get that set up. I start to wonder, and I'm assuming that, based on intensity, they're adjusting, they're sort of sliding sort of how much carbohydrate versus fat you're burning. So the higher intensity of a workout, they're assuming that the athlete is burning more carbohydrate. And that's what we see in the metabolic test. Lower intensity, longer endurance, higher volume, it's a little bit more towards the fat side of things. And then from there, we can sort of start looking back at, hey, you did this workout. TrainingPeaks is suggesting that you burnt this amount of carbohydrate calories. How should we adjust your fueling during training? Right? What should your recovery look like after training? So that way we can sort of fill the bucket that is your training and give you the proper nourishment that can help you with performance and recovery the best going forward.
I was going to mention just kind of before we wrap up about TrainingPeaks and just my experience, comparing what I see in TrainingPeaks in terms of those recommendations as compared to what I know as best practices in terms of recommendations. And I wanted to mention, I have had some really great conversations with Adam Pulford, who does the Train Right podcast. And he's really enlightened me in terms of how he uses the kilojoules to determine those grams per hour for rides. And so I do fall back on that when advising athletes. And I'll use just this one example. It's this one petite female rider. And it's quite a ways off for me in terms of what TrainingPeaks is advising and what, like if I use that kilojoule kind of formula. And that's, I guess, another thing I grapple with is in nutrition practice, Jared, we're on a daily basis typically advising athletes on grams per kilogram. But then when we get on the bike, we're working on more absolutes like, 2 hours, 45 to 60 grams, 3+ hours, 90+ grams. And when I use this kilojoule formula, I find for the smaller, typically female riders, it's quite a bit lower than those kind of what we would consider best practices in recommendations for like on the bike for carbs. So anyway, that's just something I've been grappling with and just like my little comparison of one athlete against what TrainingPeaks is advising. I just saw kind of a significant difference.
That's something that I get a lot with athletes planning their nutrition for an event. There's all this like media being thrown at us, on the gram or in YouTube videos and such is so-and-so had, 160 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And this, 65, 70-year-old, 145-pound Ironman cyclist is like, well, then I need to have that much, right? And, oh, no, that's not the case, right? You actually are going to be just fine with 70 or 80 grams of carbohydrate per hour. So I guess there's a possibility that the apps like TrainingPeaks might help the athlete understand exactly how much, not exactly, but give them a better idea of how much they need and how much they need to adjust their fueling strategies based off of how much they're putting out and how much of what they're putting out is carbohydrate.
So now I thought we'd just quickly touch on Fuelin. I think I'm the only one that's had any kind of experience with this one. So anyway, I just, again, curious because I've seen this with a few of my athletes. It's populating in TrainingPeaks. And, I've had conversations with the athletes that have been using it. And for them, it didn't stick. They didn't carry on with it for whatever reason. And again, I just did some kind of basic math. I was just comparing, again, what I know to be best practices compared to what I was seeing the recommendations in TrainingPeaks with Fuelin. And quite honestly, I could not make rhyme nor reason of what they were recommending. Like the proteins and fats were fluctuating quite a bit. And I guess my understanding of sport nutrition is the protein and fats are staying relatively constant. It's more that the carbs are fluctuating based on the demands of the work and objectives of the workouts. Then I'd see I'd compare 2 exact days and it'd be entirely different carbohydrate protein, fat. So I was having a really hard time understanding the pattern.
Yeah, I'm kind of in that same boat. It almost felt like Fuelin was cluttering up what I would see with my athletes on TrainingPeaks. And with the two athletes that I had who were using it, they didn't use it a very long time. And it's just sort of like sitting there in the background.
Yeah. So I guess for me personally as a coach, it did clutter up TrainingPeaks so much. I was like, I can't take it.
Yeah. So you just talked about the cluttered experience from the perspective of the coach or the RD, right? What's the impact that this has on the athlete?
I mean, I'm assuming not great since the ones that I had using it didn't stick with it. So I don't know. It just didn't seem like they found it very valuable.
Yeah, I guess here's my perspective as the RD is from understanding the app and looking at the website and who's developed it. It's really set up for that group. Like they make it where, yes, the people can have it and they don't need to be signed up with the Fuelin coaches and dietitians. But it seems like it really is set up like maybe if those dietitians are in the background on the dashboard helping populate and customize it and go over it, maybe it's more effective. But for the rest of us, even the providers, we're sort of left in the dark, it feels like. Like we can't do much with it. We have no control. We can't make adjustments. And we have to do it as like third party. But like, hey, you should change this on your Fuelin. Well, we're not experts on the Fuelin app. We're not going to be able to. So to me, it's a great idea, but it's not quite open for everybody to use effectively.
That makes perfect sense, Jared. So I was going to move on to athletes coach. So Jared, you had some experience, right? You got the free trial.
I'm trying. I'm trying so hard. I've been in conversation, which is like this like delayed conversation because I think the app is somewhere in Europe. I think maybe Germany. And so you're working with the developer there trying to set you up. So you can't just automatically set up with the provider account. And so my experience from it goes as deep as watching their video as to how does the Fuelin app work for providers, right? And how does it work for the athlete? And from what I was watching, I just really liked the concept. So it really, to me, like the idea that the app will give you recommendations based off of what your training is and what your daily eating styles are. It'll tell you how much carbs, fat, protein you need to have at each meal, how much you should target during your training based off of what TrainingPeaks or you told it that you were doing. And then the cool thing about the app, you know, if it does work this way, I don't have experience with it yet because I'm not set up on it yet, but it is supposed to adjust sort of based off of what happened. So if you didn't get in what you told the app you were going to do, but then it saw what you did, it'll say, because you did this and you had this for breakfast, well, now this is what you need to have for your post-workout recovery. Here's what your lunch should look like. And it automatically adjusts all the total calories and it'll adjust the macros based off that information. So to me, that sounds amazing. They have a library of foods based off of some of the big databases around the world and in specific countries. I have an athlete that I want to try it out. The one hang up I think is I don't think they're in the normal US sort of we'd measure in ounces and cups and like, I don't know, quarters of of a tablespoon, whatever. So it's a little, they haven't quite gotten there. They're more in that, I would say the metric scale, which is commendable and a, super smart way to do it, but we're not that smart in the US. So.
Well, I did sign up. I signed up for the athletes version because I was the same as you, Jared. I wasn't able to get onto the coach's cockpit, but I did guinea pig myself as an athlete. And it was my first experience using any of these types of apps personally, and I thought it was pretty slick. And it was a total eye-opener. And it cracked me up because it's like, I am so far off the mark.
Oh, goodness.
All the things you tell your athletes to do, I was so far off the mark. And I mean, I just really liked it. It's pretty simple, and I think that's good enough. To my knowledge, I don't know, Jared, I don't know if this syncs with TrainingPeaks so it can actually view more details about an athlete's training plan, but I just entered pretty simple stuff like FTP, like the nature of the ride, intervals, endurance, the race, time. And then prior to that, it asked all the demographic profiling, age, weight, kind of your goals, that sort of thing. But yeah, I think it's pretty slick.
Yeah, and didn't it use, if I remember right, it used like a Harris-Benedict equation or another equation to predict your RMR?
Yeah, one was that was more athletically inclined.
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like it's asking and it's doing a lot of the right things. So to me, that seems the most promising. And remember when you introduced me to it, I got real excited about it. So I'm definitely still interested in wanting to sort of try out and see it from a provider standpoint, because I feel like that's what Fuelin was maybe trying to do, but doesn't offer for providers, right? And so it's like, hey, if I can actually be in the background, in the dashboard, helping the athlete populate their resting metabolic rate, because I was able to test it in my lab, and then I can help figure out if the workouts need to be adjusted or not, or the FTP is giving the right output, and we can really dial things in. That's powerful for me.
And as I've said, along the way here, we're not looking for perfection. But for me, just my personal experience is like, wow, I have some things I can do to get better. Not to hit every single value absolutely perfectly, but it was a big eye-opener for me.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear.
I guess my one thing, I would be curious to know if it can sync with TrainingPeaks. And like in that case, then maybe it would be thinking of the whole week as a sequence as opposed to isolated workouts and advising based on those isolated workouts. So something to be determined.
Yeah, you bring up a good point that I kind of wanted to make sure I mentioned is just the natural ability, I kind of went into this earlier, of the body to regulate and adjust. And some of that's good, some of that's bad. But say like, I think TrainingPeaks, it's logging all of the work that we've done in our training, whether it's all biking or swimming and running and biking and lifting, we can get a pretty good estimate. It's still an estimate of energy expenditure. Well, when you see a big day, right, you might see something like 5,000 calories were expended today, right? Now you're thinking like these apps are going to try to ask you to consume like 5,000 calories. That's a big ask. And that may not happen, right? So with that in mind, we have to respect that, if we do pretty good, maybe we just focus on the carbohydrates and not worried about the total volume of energy expenditure and rely a little bit of our body to regulate itself and allow us to sort of satisfy hunger the next day or 2 days later and make up for some of those carbohydrates, then we're going to be in a good spot. However, if like you kind of mentioned, I was way off the mark, right? Well, for not letting our body naturally sort of cueing into its natural hunger, right? Then our body might sort of downregulate itself. It might just start sort of slowing its metabolism down. It might try to just conserve calories and maybe try to store a little extra as fat. And then we're wondering, hey, why is our body composition off? Or why is my energy always low? And so those are the things that maybe using the numbers that we get from these apps can help us override this thing that we're missing with downregulated metabolism.
We did also want to touch on MyFitnessPal and Cronometer, and host Trevor Connor has had a lot of experience with both. So we asked him to share his thoughts with us.
I've used both MyFitnessPal and Cronometer pretty extensively, so I'm pretty familiar with both apps and definitely have my preference. I'm still using Cronometer. But let's dive into each. Start with MyFitnessPal. It's probably the most popular nutrition app out there. They have a very large number of people that are using it. I would say in terms of just a simple app where it's easy to record what you're eating, it's no frills, but it really gets the job done. It integrates well with TrainingPeaks. It's a really good choice. Their approach is a little more kind of open source with their nutrition information. Anybody can enter food. So if you are a MyFitnessPal user and you put a food in there, it goes into their master database, and then anybody can see that food. And there's pros and cons of that. Nice side is there's hardly a food that exists that you can't find in the app, but you don't always know how good the information is and how thoroughly it was filled out. So when I was using MyFitnessPal pretty extensively, I think it was great for tracking calories, protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And I know that's what Jared really cares about. I think it did a great job for that. It was just a good, decent way to track the basic information for my nutrition. But if I wanted to go deeper, if I really wanted to get into the nutrient values, the micronutrients, which I do find important, that's actually what I personally look at more. It just never really provided what I wanted. And that led me to Cronometer, which takes a very different approach. And I would say scientifically, this is the deepest of the apps. If you go to their website, or use their app, you can constantly link to articles that are going to tell you the values of different ratios, the values of different nutrients. But more importantly, they are connected to several of the main accepted nutrition databases. So these are the databases that would be used by RDs, by researchers, where they did a pretty rigorous breakdown of the nutritional content of the various foods. And this is really important because some of the databases are better than others. Again, when you look at something like MyFitnessPal, somebody's entering the information, you just don't know if they did a really accurate job with it. With Cronometer, they show you whenever you pick a food what database it comes from, and that really allows you to know which information you can trust. For example, if it's coming from the NCCH database, this is pretty scientifically validated. This is good information about that particular food. I always use the NCCH database when I can in Cronometer because it's one of the few that will actually break down the polyunsaturated fatty acids into omega-3s and omega-6, which is really important for me. And surprisingly, a lot of these databases don't show potassium content of the food. And again, that NCCH database has that. So when you go into Cronometer, it's going to give you a huge amount of information about the micronutrient breakdown of your foods, far more than any of the other databases. Of course, it gives you calories, it gives you protein, fat, carbohydrates. I know Jared's not a huge fan of this, but it's going to show you metabolic support, mitochondrial support, all those sorts of things. But what I actually go immediately to in Cronometer, because I'm less interested in counting calories, it has several of the key really important ratios. When you're talking about health, our sodium to potassium ratio is really important. Omega-3 to omega-6 ratio is really important. Calcium-magnesium ratio is really important. And then there's several others. Those are the three I care the most about. And I actually look at those more than I look at my calories or my particular macro breakdown. So I would say Cronometer is the most science-heavy of all the apps if you're really trying to dig into analyzing the health side of your diet. It does integrate with TrainingPeaks. I find it integrates pretty decently, but I would say that's kind of the differences between the tools. If you're just looking for that basic, user-friendly, simple tool, MyFitnessPal is great. If you're looking for the deep science and really looking at the health side, I would definitely take a look at Cronometer.
Healthy eating can be a challenge. Sports nutrition is all about knowing what to eat, when, how much, and avoiding temptations that can derail your plans. I'm Jared Berg, and I'm a registered dietitian and exercise physiologist with Fast Talk Labs. I've created a new 8-week sports nutrition course to help you break old habits and establish healthier, high-performance fueling practices for years to come. Learn more and get started on fasttalklabs.com. Look for athlete services and sports nutrition.
I would say, Jared, to your point about the data, it's only as good as the input. I think these apps are doing a great job removing those barriers to make it easier to log because it's kind of cumbersome and you're kind of like, ugh. And you get behind a little bit at the end of the day and you're like, oh my God, it feels like work. But now with these options to scan barcodes, it's pretty slick.
Yeah, especially if that technology gets better at like taking a scan of your plate and having it like, hey, this is what I see on your plate. And, I understand the plate is this size and this much of it's filled with this amount of food. And to be able to predict your macros and total calories just from looking at a plate, that would be the next level, right?
Yeah, definitely. So let's start working towards wrapping up and focus a little bit on what we perceive as the value and perhaps the concerns of these apps. So why don't we start with the values? What do you guys perceive as being valuable about these apps and features?
I think there's a couple of different things that I really like about these apps and what they're providing. First and foremost, especially when I was seeing patients, and that would be patients who were athletes, that'd be patients who were undergoing cancer treatment at the same time. I think any individual, as long as they're screened for no, disordered eating patterns or something like that, can benefit from a tool that acts as a reflector back to them, that acts as a mirror. This is what's going on. Did you know? And I can hear Trevor in the back of my mind right now talking about certain interventions like, well, once you hit the pros, it's only going to help, X percentage when you get to that level. But I do think that the tools now that provide trends, like we just mentioned a little bit ago, of stacking data and then saying, are you aware of this as a big picture, can be really helpful. Because the one downside sometimes of analog dietary logging and the different symptoms and the activities that you do is that you can get so stuck in the details and get so lost in analyzing the data yourself of like, oh, well, this is exactly what happened, that this is exactly what happened, that we don't necessarily get to step back and see greater trends that these tools are able to pull together automatically and over time. So I think that's one of my favorite things. I think also just the sheer existence of these tools and how we're able to introduce conversations both in a clinical encounter and in a meeting with your coach, that you're able to say how it gets used in your training protocol and how it gets used in your life. So I think it's sheer existence is a great conversation starter. And then lastly, I would say that a hot topic right now, especially you're talking about macros, you're talking about these nutrients, there's a really big conversation happening across the country with our protein obsession. And so I think when a lot of athletes are talking about what nutrients that they actually need, protein is having such a domination in the conversation right now that these apps might, if used responsibly, serve as a tool to bring some of these obsessive conversations into check. So as far as timely things, I think that these tools could help prove you don't need to go off the deep end on some of these nutrients and just be a great data point that can speak louder and more clearly than some of the social media influencers who are speaking to especially vulnerable athletes who think this is the way to make their gains.
What are your thoughts, Jared?
I feel like as far as the pros and the cons of the apps, the biggest pro, Griffin mentioned it, is that reflection, that ability for you to think about how you're energizing your body. What are you getting in? How much are you getting in? And how is that nourishing your daily life and your training life? And to me, that's like the biggest thing that these apps can provide. If you're not quite sure if you're actually, meeting the needs of a specific workout, and that, the app can sort of help you like think about it and give you, some tools and just figure out how many carbohydrates are in this particular food that I ate, how much fat is in my diet in general. And is maybe if I look at my macronutrients, could cut a little bit of fat out, add a little bit more carbohydrate, make sure my protein stays at this specific level. Right? Because I will see athletes who have a challenge with getting enough energy in on the daily, and they'll end up leaning towards fat because fat is just easier. You don't have to eat as much of it to meet your daily energy needs. Well, is that really doing the athlete justice? Yes, it is. I mean, the bottom line is making sure that we're in good energy balance, especially for the athlete I'm describing, right? However, we can do it even better if we get the carbohydrates more dialed and we have proteins at a certain level. So we're taking it one step further, and that one step further is going to improve recovery. It's going to energize workouts, and it could also help with mood and help with sleep. All these different things can be affected when we're using these apps wisely, or ideally we're cueing in to our natural hunger and satiety cues or feedback. The apps just give us a little bit more accountability and information, but they shouldn't be the end all. And we can definitely get obsessive on every aspect of our life. And we have to, remember that there's more than just fueling with food. There's enjoyment, there's culture, there is art with culinary and eating. And so we don't want to lose that and have that all lost in some application on our phone.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I think for me, the value is just building more accurate awareness in terms of what we think we're doing and what we're actually doing. And I know it's been said about other devices, but it does gamify it, and it's kind of fun. And I hate to call them habits, but kind of gamifies better habits. And just generally, like we've said all along, we're not striving for perfection. We're just striving to move to a better place. And I think it can do that. I think my concern is, as we've discussed, like these different personalities that we're dealing with and kind of understanding those personalities. And I think in endurance sport, where power to weight ratio is so critical, as an endurance athlete, weight can be a very slippery slope. So I think being very mindful and aware of that. And again, I think it really depends on the person. And I think as I also touched on, just not turning your mind and your total decision-making over to devices and AI and data, but just using it, better understand yourself and better inform decisions.
I love that part too, Julie, because I think, I was preparing for this episode and looking at how someone is utilizing a tool like this. One of the best questions that I saw that people were saying to their athletes was, what does this app not know about you that it should? What's missing here that the app doesn't know about you, that if it knew, it might make a different recommendation? And simply by asking an athlete that question or telling the athlete to start thinking about that helps them not only create a buffer between them and the app and it being that kind of almighty effect that we talked about, but it also helps them take this recommendation that it might pop out as not medical advice, not guaranteed, and applying critical thinking of, it doesn't understand that this, and you're, again, creating this empowered user. So I think that was one of my favorite ways to utilize this and to keep it in check.
So Jared, if you were to kind of take the best of all worlds, so we're not just going to totally hand everything over to devices and apps, but like in your practice, for example, where you're working one-on-one with athletes, but you're also implementing some of these apps and this technology, what do you propose as the best of all worlds where you can have that good knowledge base and then just kind of be guiding yourself or maybe working with someone like yourself, just kind of coupling it all together, good knowledge and using some of this technology?
So best of all worlds, it would be using this app to really understand your energy needs, right? Maintain energy balance, figure out how your macros are dialed, and use the app for that purpose. Don't rely on it like a crutch. Don't become obsessive over it. Take a break every now and then. And that break should almost be an education opportunity itself to really understand, how well do I do on my own? How good are my hunger and satiety cues if I just listen to my sort of inner voices and, what I feel like I need? So definitely like on and off, that would be like the best of both worlds, being able to like eat well intuitively, right? And then being able to, like you say, gamify, match up as good as you possibly can inside that app with your energy in and your energy out. And then going even deeper into the best of all worlds would be to check in with your blood work, see how your nutrition is doing, meet with your physician, meet with an RD, see if there's any sort of holes or areas in your nutrition that app will never be able to see, and to see if there's anywhere that we can improve based off of, like Griffin has mentioned, off of those more subjective measures, like how do you feel you're doing? How are you feeling in and around your training and your daily life? Where's your mood? Where's your sleep? In combining all those things together and having conversation with your coach, with an RD, with the physician or another, nutrition type practitioner, and really sort of dialing things in, keeping smart about as much as you possibly can.
It's interesting that you say that about how that data gets used over the years. And Jared, I'm sure that you saw this in your education to become an RD. Clinical decision models over the years have been pretty fascinating diagrams with patients now being at the center, right? Or even historically, this hierarchy. And when it comes to apps like these, and I was looking at best practices for implementation, I saw a conversation about tiered decision models and how the first tier, the very, very base one, which is like the bottom, is all of this data. And that's almost the least important data that you can be incorporating into a hierarchical decision model. Incorporating this, the next one would be your own personal history. So the last time I did this particular ride under Fueled, I bonked. So I know from having done this before, this is what I need to do. And then this next tier up being your body feedback. So again, the things that we prioritized, and that final call being you personally, the athlete. You're making the decision, not the app. So I think it's really important for people to keep in mind there is a hierarchy here.
There is, yeah. That's a great illustration. I love that.
Yeah, that's a good visual, Griffin. So Jared, you've been on this podcast before, so you kind of know how we wrap up with your 1 minute kind of summary wrap up of the episode. So I'll let you take it away.
So I definitely feel like these apps They can be a powerful, very useful tool, but we still need to cue into old-fashioned sort of hunger and satiety cues, right? We need to listen to our bodies. We need to trust ourselves, but use these apps as a way to check, to see how are we doing and can we do better? Right? These apps can provide some pretty good information on how much we need to do to recover, how many carbohydrates we can put into, what our protein needs are based off of our resting metabolic rate. There's all kinds of data that we can put in, but they are, again, like I mentioned before, only as smart as the information that we give them. And also, they are a work in progress. And so, you can help them grow as you grow as an athlete.
That's great, Jared. Griffin, anything else to add?
I would go back to setting up kind of a contract with yourself or with your coach about how you're going to use this. Understand that you can't use this without a human. And I think to sum up some of the comments I've talked about in building an empowered user is before you open the app, asking yourself, if you're a coach listening or an RD, empowering the athlete to say, okay, before you open the app and see what the app has to say to you, what's your evaluation? What's your analysis? What do you think the data would show? And then start to be able to build up that confidence over time to understand your body, to understand the symptoms that you're experiencing, to understand your hunger and satiety signals, to start to build your own kind of wisdom with your body and how you need to fuel or how you need to recover. So I think one of my favorite things is this is a really great tool, but do not underestimate that the learned data that will be provided to you by any of these tools can be really, really great when you look at the learned tool attached to your neck, right? That brain. So if you try to build up your own model at the same time, maybe that's the part that really needs to be gamified.
So for me, I think the biggest thing that comes up is that it's still individual, like everything else. It's always individual. I think a lot of times we want to be told in absolutes, do this, and nutrition, like so many other things, is just so far from that. And so I think as with everything, it just takes time experimenting. Obviously, you want to be working with those best practices, whether that's working, one-on-one with Jared, in conjunction with some of this technology, or you want to, give this technology a go. But even with those ranges, you're still going to take time to experiment, different rides, like Griffin had pointed out, just kind of being really cognizant of how you're responding to these different fueling strategies with different training sessions, and just continue to just dial it in for yourself, because initially, you're probably going to be working with some pretty big ranges. And then eventually through experimentation and just experience, you're going to be able to really dial in those ranges for yourself.
Well, that's a great wrap up on your inaugural episode as a Fast Talk co-host here. Julie, that was great.
Thanks. I enjoyed that. That was super fun.
So here's this episode's question for the forum. Do you or have you used one of these nutrition apps? Maybe it's just a feature. If so, what was your experience? Head over to forums.fasttalklabs.com to participate. That was another episode of Fast Talk. The thoughts and opinions expressed on Fast Talk are those of the individual. Subscribe to Fast Talk wherever you prefer to find your favorite podcasts. Be sure to leave us a rating and a review. As always, we love your feedback. Tweet at us at @FastTalkLabs, join the conversation at forums.fasttalklabs.com, or learn from our experts at fasttalklabs.com. For Brent Bookwalter, Dr. Paul Larson, Jared Berg, Julie Young, and Trevor Connor, I'm Dr. Griffin McMath. Thanks for listening.